So what I'm going to do is, again, just changing things up a little bit, is I'm going to invite Lauren to come and give us our Bible reading now. And the reason that I'm going to do this is because I'm going to give you a glimpse as to what I'm going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at the story of where Jesus meets a leper, and this leper comes out and meets Jesus and asks him to heal. And the thing I'm struck with, and we're going to be looking at this in more detail, is the fact that he says to Jesus, if you were willing, and Jesus says, I am willing, right? And I'm just struck by the fact that Jesus, his heart sees this man whose life is broken, and we're going to be explaining what leprosy is about and why that matters. And this man whose life is utterly broken and who's been outcast for years, and that Jesus says, I am willing to do this, which means, and this is for each of us, is that it doesn't matter how messed up our life is. We are the ones that quite often ostracize ourselves, right? Yet we need to grasp this. If we come to Jesus, if you were willing, the answer is Jesus says, I am willing. So that's number one. The second thing that we're looking at is that Jesus reaches out and touches this person, a person who has got leprosy, who has spent their entire life on the outside, away from people, because they didn't know what leprosy was. They just knew that it was uncurable. So nobody wanted to touch. And Jesus reaches out and touches. And I just want to say to you this morning that whatever your life's like at the moment, whatever's going on at the moment, one touch from the King changes everything. Lauren, do you want to come and give us our reading?
So this is Luke 5 from verse 12. Jesus heals a man with leprosy. In one of the villages, Jesus met a man with an advanced case of leprosy. When the man saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said, be healed. And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Then Jesus instructed him not to tell anyone what had happened. He said, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. But despite Jesus' instructions, the report of his power spread even faster, and vast crowds came to hear him preach and to be healed of their diseases. But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer.
So, as a church, we are working our way through Luke's gospel. And the question is, why? Why are we doing Luke's gospel? Well, several reasons. One of the main reasons is that we say and we recognize as a church that we worship Jesus. But actually, if I'm honest, and this is for somebody who's been in church for most of my life, it's really easy as Christians to use certain language more so than others. Okay, I'm going to explain what I mean by this. First one is, many of us will quite happily tell our friends we go to church. I go to church, right? Many of us will say, I have faith. I have a faith. That's quite acceptable. Many of us are okay saying, hey, listen, I worship God, right? I'm a Christian. I worship God. Again, each step slightly more difficult to state. But the next one, I worship Jesus. There's something that's uncomfortable in the statement that I'm a Christian and I love Jesus. I'm a Christian and I believe that Jesus has the power to do what he says he does. Because there's something about that makes us suddenly slightly different. And I believe that there is power in the name of Jesus. We sing it. It's in all of our songs. We believe that his name is above all names. But how comfortable are we to say that actually I worship Jesus? And so if we're a church, then that's what we believe, then it's crucial that we actually go through and understand who Jesus is. What is he about? Why am I saying that actually I worship Jesus? What's that got to do with me? And so that's what we're doing. We're taking time and we're basically working our way through Luke's gospel because we want to grasp who Jesus is and be excited by the fact that this is who we worship and be waiting for Jesus to return, because we know when he does, everything's going to change. Okay, so there's your glimpse. That's why we're doing this. And we've been working our way through Luke's Gospel, and we're in chapter 5. And as we heard literally just moments before the worship began, the passage that we're going to be reading on. So I'm going to be basically taking this apart and just having a little bit of a look at this. So quick recap. A man is in a village. We don't know his name. We know nothing about him, other than the fact that he has advanced leprosy. And he sees Jesus, asks Jesus to heal him. Jesus says that he's willing. Jesus touches him, and then he's healed. And then from that, we then move on to Jesus giving him some instructions as to what he's to do next. And that, at the end, it then finishes with Jesus. We've been told that Jesus is in a pattern of going into the wilderness. So let's start at the top and work our way down and see if we can grasp a little bit about why I'm genuinely excited to preach this passage. First of all, what is leprosy? Right? Because it doesn't appear to be a big thing anymore, right? But like if you were to go back, even like a couple of 100 years ago, leprosy was a big deal. So what is leprosy? Leprosy is also known as Hansen's disease. And for thousands of years, it was thought to be highly contagious, passed on by who knows what. So they presumed touch. Others believed it to be in the air around an individual. Do you know, it wasn't until the mid-20th century that we discovered a cure. And that cure, bizarrely enough, is antibiotics. Now, there's no reason at all for anybody in the world anywhere to suffer from leprosy. But you go back before the 20th century, and this is a deadly disease. So what does leprosy do? Well, it looks like a nasty rash, but it attacks both your nervous system as well as your respiratory system. What it does with your nervous system is it basically shuts down your ability to feel and to touch. So you are unaware if you catch yourself on something. You are unaware of pain. Now, to many of us, like that sounds fabulous, doesn't it? Right? Yeah? Like to not have pain, right? I'm getting some nods in the room. Yeah? Some of us. But imagine if you took that away altogether, right? Your pain, the ability to receive pain, is quite often actually a blessing. For example, if I'm cooking and I put my hand on if I've got an electric stove, old school electric stove, and I put my hand on it, I know within a split second to remove it because it hurts. But imagine you didn't have that. So you're standing there in the kitchen, and what do you recognize? You recognize a disgusting smell of roast pork. Oh, it's my hand, right? So that's where the nervous system comes in greatly needed, right? It's because we don't realize that we've hurt ourselves. So if you were to shut down your nervous system, you would constantly be injuring yourself and being unaware of it. And then you then end up with wide open sores that bleed, which then leads to the cross of disease and everything that goes with that. So one of the reasons that leprosy is so bad is not necessarily just because of its rash, but because of the knock-on effect to the fact that you are losing limbs. It was quite normal for people with advanced leprosy to lose fingers, noses, ears, hands, arms, legs, having to be amputated because the gangrene was setting in and they had to do something with it. And nobody wanted to go near them. And you wouldn't want to either, would you? For multiple reasons. One, there's the smell that comes with. Two, there's the fear that comes with. I probably should have said it the other way around. One is the fear, because I wouldn't want that. And especially if you go back beyond that time, how are you supposed to, if I didn't know how it was transmitted, I'd want to keep as far away from you as possible if you had leprosy, wouldn't you? So, taking a look at this, Every known civilization around the world has had cases of leprosy. And because nobody knew what to do with it, didn't matter what culture you were in, you were excommunicated from the community. You were cast out from the community. Lepers would live in their own colonies. Didn't matter where. And you don't even need to go back very far. And you hear of places like Leprosy Island or the Lepers Island, or where people would literally, like, there's a space over there, let's put them over there, and there would be few people who would take it upon themselves to care for them, knowing that potentially somewhere down the line they themselves may contract it. Scary, isn't it? Can you imagine putting yourself in there? I need to say that because actually for many of us today, we've never seen anybody with leprosy. I've got nothing to base it on. The word leper has become like a derogative term, but that's where it comes from. So within the Jewish community, it was much the same. That if you were worried that you had got a rash and you were worried about what that was, then actually you would go to the temple, and bizarrely enough, the priest's job wasn't just to do worship, but the priest's job was also to diagnose potentially what you may have, and then to decide what to do with it. So if you had a rash, you'd go to the temple, and then the priest would take a look at you, looking at his books to try and work out what he thought you might have, and if he recognized that you had got the telltale signs of leprosy, then you were told to leave. And that you were told to live on the outskirts of the village. You were not allowed to come in to community. You were not allowed in. Why? Because there was a potential that you may pass this on to others. So being a leper would mean that you were utterly outside. You weren't allowed in places of public. You're on the outside. Grasp that. To the point that if for whatever reason you needed to come into a public place, in Jewish tradition you were expected to ring a bell to make statements to everybody around you that you were there, and you would have to state unclean and then ringing the bell to tell everybody. Why? To give people the chance to be able to move away. Jewish tradition was that if you came into contact with somebody who was unclean, just by touch alone made you unclean. So you wouldn't want to suddenly find yourself making accidental contact with somebody who was known to be unclean, especially a leper, because not only would you have the fear of contracting leprosy, but also you would then yourself have to move away from the rest of the culture until the end of the evening to make sure that you had been separated so that you wouldn't pass on your uncleanness to somebody else. It seems extreme, but bearing in mind what little was known about leprosy, these were all things to do with why it worked. Okay, so that's leprosy. So coming back to our story, Jesus is in a village and there's a man with leprosy. Anybody spot the problem with this story straight away? Why is he in the village? Such a true point, isn't it? Like, why is he in the village? Because if he's not allowed in public places, why is he there? And Scripture tells us that this individual is in the later stages of leprosy, right? Advanced case, which means that he's likely to be covered in bandages, that he's likely to be very smelly, that he's likely to have open wounds, that his rash is covering him. If it's an advanced case, it's likely to be covering him from head to toe. Why is he in the village? Well, he's in the village because news has got out that Jesus is there. Now, I need to point out, how would you feel if this leper walked in? Bearing in mind, there's no known cure. How would you feel if that leper walked in? You'd feel angry. You'd want him out. Like, what are you doing here? Like, don't come near me. Don't breathe on me. Like, if there's any possibility you're going to catch it, I don't want it. Wouldn't you? That's your natural reaction. So he's taking his own life into his own hands by being there because people don't want him. And traditions were different back then. Now, I note this. Jesus is there, and the man walks over, right? And he puts his face on the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you were willing, can you heal me? Now, love this. Because this tells us just a glimpse of Jesus. I said it at the beginning. If you are willing. Now, Jesus is looking at this man, and I imagine everybody around is also looking at the man too, and looking at what is Jesus going to do. Because the natural reaction is, get out. You are not welcome here. But Jesus' reaction is quite the opposite. See, Jesus looks at this man, and I genuinely believe his heart breaks for this person who has been on the outside of community, not knowing human touch, not knowing friendship. His family can't have anything to do with him, even if they wanted to have anything to do with him. This man has been alone, surrounded only by the possibility that there may be other lepers who are in exactly the same place. This man's move to come into the village to seek out Jesus is bold, bolder than you can understand. And he puts his head on the ground and he says, if you were willing. And Jesus' reaction is, he says, I am willing. Be healed. Okay? So grasp this. Jesus speaks and healing happens. We're going to come back and take a look at that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But just place yourself in there for a moment, right? This man's got leprosy. We know this. It's an advanced state. What does it look like to watch somebody be healed instantly of that? What does that look like? If he's missing fingers, does his fingers come back? Anybody else? Like, I wish they'd tell us, right? The skin becomes crystal clear. Skin like a baby. We've got 2 babies in the house, right? Like, what does that look like? Can you imagine the sense of awe and wow as everybody around suddenly watches this happen? And this is the power of Jesus, right? He says, be healed. And he's healed. Leprosy was brutal. What does that look like? Next thing is, he's then told, Jesus gives instructions. Jesus instructed him not to tell anyone. I love this. Jesus loves to do this. Don't tell anyone what's happened. And he says, go to the priest and let him examine you. And we looked at this before because the Jews believed that the priests are the only people who say you can have it. But equally, it's the only people that can say that you don't have it. So it's all very well him being healed and going back to his family. But if he walks in through the door, even looking clean, healed, his family are going to be excited. But he can't enter community because everybody around him is waiting for it to come back. You can't be clean unless you've been told that you're clean. So this makes sense why suddenly he's got to go and let the priest examine him, taking along the offerings. And if you're interested, you can actually find this in Leviticus 14, and it tells you how to go through that. Not going to go into that today. But the explanation is that you have to take an offering to give to God to say thank you for the fact that you are now healed. And so he's told to do this. Notice, if a man is walking through the village, is on the way towards Jerusalem, taking along the offerings given, everybody's going to know his story. His story will get out before they even have a conversation with him that he's been healed. So whether he tells people or not, everybody's going to know. I think that's pretty exciting anyways, right? This will be the public testimony that you've been cleansed. That's why. Right? And then the next verse finishes with, but, and I love this, despite Jesus' instructions, the report of his power spread even faster. And you could see why, couldn't you? I mean, we hear the story, and there's a man, he had leprosy, and he was healed. Woo! Right? But actually, when you look at it, like it's big deal. Big deal. And what does it do? It causes even greater crowds coming to hear him preach and to be healed of their diseases. And then the passage for today finishes with this one singular verse, verse 16. But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. If you were with us a couple of weeks back, Lauren preached, and she gave a bit of an explanation as to what that was about. And I want to encourage you, if you missed out on that, to go back and to have a listen. You can see that on our YouTube channel or on Facebook. But there is a need, and Jesus keeps doing this. It's a pattern of Jesus' lifestyle, is that not only was he around the crowds, not only was he explaining the heart of God, not only was he doing incredible miracles, but he's also pulling himself away and to spend time with God on his own in prayer. And I would say, listen, guys, if there was ever something that we needed to try and do and put into our lives, is just that, the necessity to pull yourselves away from the busyness and to choose to spend time in God's presence. Okay. Let's go back and just take a quick look at that miracle and why it's such a big deal. I hinted at this as we moved into worship. But let's just take a look at the two things. The first one is this: word. Jesus spoke. Jesus spoke. This is a pattern that Luke gives us to do with the miracles of Jesus. That Jesus speaks and something happens. Now, if you were to take a look at John's gospel, it tells us that in the very beginning, Jesus was the Word. And as God spoke, the Word, creation was created. Right? I think that's just one of those incredible things as if you begin to grasp that Jesus was at the beginning. He didn't just arrive on Christmas Day, guys. He didn't. He'd been around from the very beginning. And that creation, which means the world, was started because he spoke. Now Jesus is doing this in person whilst wandering around. His miracles are he speaks and something happens. We need to grasp this. Why? Because when stuff goes wrong in our lives, what do? We cry out to God for him to step in and to do something. And we need to know that the Jesus that we worship, the Jesus we're inviting into that situation, is the same that started with stars being created. He's the same one who heals people, who casts out demons by merely speaking, and it happens. If we can grasp this, then instead of us being worried about the sheer size of the trouble that we're in, or the storm that we're in, or this chapter that feels like it's overwhelming, instead of that being our narrative, when we realize how amazing Jesus is, the Jesus that we worship, when we recognize that we're inviting Jesus, the Creator, into our story to transform our life situation, then our onlook is different. Guys, we need to grasp this. This is the Jesus that we worship. Just one word. I am willing, he says, and then says, be healed. In Greek, that is literally just one word. It means be clean. I'm going to attempt to say it in Greek. Are you ready for this? Katharasetheti. I'm never going to say that again. You've heard it once. All right? But in Greek, it's one word. Just one word. And this man is transformed, literally transformed. His life is not just transformed from the illness, but suddenly he's no longer on the outside, he's on the inside. He's no longer outcast, he's now in. And this is the amazing thing of who Jesus is. Second thing is touch. Why does touch matter? Well, we just looked at it. He's been a leper for goodness knows how long in an advanced case, which means it's literally an advanced case. He's been on the outside of community for so long. Nobody wants to go near him, let alone touch him. And what does Jesus do? He touches. Second thing, as I mentioned, if you even touch somebody who is unclean, what happens? You become unclean. So notice this, as Jesus says, I am willing, and then reaches out to touch him, and then says, be clean, right? Be healed. That in theory, he should be the one who is made unclean. Isn't that, that's how it works? You touch somebody, Jesus touches somebody, which means what? Jesus should be unclean. But what happens? The opposite happens. Instead of him becoming unclean, the power in him makes the man clean. That's huge. I just love that. It's like a complete swap round, spin round on everything. Just one touch from Jesus changes everything. To quote Godfrey Birdle, just one touch from the King changes everything. I think there's something in that. Guys, this is the Jesus that we worship. This is not just a miracle, but it's a miracle that shows the heart of God, both in word and in deed. So, finally, guys, what does it have to do with you and me? What does it have to do with you and me? Why does it matter? Why does it matter that Jesus did that 2,000 years ago? Well, the answer is simple. It's this. What's your leprosy? What's your disease? Or put more bluntly, what's the things in your life that's keeping you on the outside? What's the things in your life that is just overwhelming you? What is the difficulty that you're struggling with? What's your storm? What's your chapter? All these terms are used, only you know this. But quite often, that's the thing that keeps you on the outside. That's the thing that stops you from pressing into God. That's the thing that when you wake up in the morning is the first thing on your mind. It could be grief of the past. It could be shame of the past. It could be a physical illness that you yourself have. It could be multiple things, but it's enough to keep you feeling like, oh, if only people knew. Or I'm just overwhelmed by the pressure of life. And there's an invitation. I love that Jesus didn't go to seek out this man. I love that this man chose to take his life into his own hands and to step in. I love this because there's an invitation there for you and me. And that's this. Are you willing to take yourself out of your comfort zone? He could have stayed in his leprosy camp. He could have stayed out on the outside and he would have never been healed. But he chose to take his life into his own hands and to come into the village to meet Jesus. And I want to tell you today, guys, if you want a breakthrough in your life, how desperate are you? Are you prepared to potentially take life into your own hands and to step out and say, Jesus, I need you? Right? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, know this. It wasn't just that the man walked in and said, if you're willing, and Jesus said, I'm not. It would have been a very different story. But he steps in and says, if you're willing, and Jesus says, I am willing. Guys, if you want to experience Jesus, I want to invite you to come, to seek him, to take one touch from Jesus, because it will change everything.